SpectreVision Radio.
Welcome to Caribbean Mystics Podcast,
where we marry mysticism, superstition, and lore. I'm your host, Paulina.
And I'm your host, Gabrielle, and we are your resident Caribbean Mystics.
Join us today as we explore the depths of real supernatural stories
told by real people located right in our very own backyard.
My name is Bish Curtin. My maiden name is Denham. My family has been on St. John since 1927 when my grandparents bought Trunk Bay. So it's almost 100 years that there has been somebody from my mother's side of the family that has lived on St. John. I currently live in Texas and have lived there about 45 years. I grew up on St. John. I was born in California, and my mother and father moved us back here to the islands in 1955. And so I spent the most informative years of my life here on St. John, and I will always consider it home. Growing up here on St. John was the best time. We were still very village oriented. It takes a village to raise a child, and we had a strong yard culture here, and everybody was living pretty much the same way. Our homes were not elaborate, a lot of old-fashioned West Indian shacks. We lived in a 4-room shack up in Gift Hill for many years. My grandmother had a guest house at Trunk Bay. We kids could run around and everybody knew who belonged to who, and myself and my sister being blonde-haired, blue-eyed, white kids, everybody knew who we were, and we couldn't get away with anything. We were protected, and we had basically the full run of the island as our playground. My story begins around when I was about 6 or 7 years old, so that would have been 1956 or 1957. There's a place called Gallows Point on St. John, right outside of Cruz Bay. And at that time, it was owned by Kay and Duke Ellington, and they had, I'm not sure, 4 or 5 little cottages that they rented out, and a bar where local people used to go after work to have a beer and talk politics and gossip. And one afternoon, late in the afternoon after work, my parents were out there and my sister and I were out there, and it was getting on towards dusk, and I was getting tired, and my mother said I should go to one of the houses. It was called the Red House, which was basically a simple concrete house that had a kitchen and porch area that was also the living room, dining room area, and then a long, narrow porch off to one side to the left, and off of that narrow porch were 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. And at the other end of this narrow porch was a second entrance into the house, but it was closed off by a very large lime tree. And you couldn't use that entrance because the lime tree was so big and thorny. So I walked up the steps into the Red House, and something drew my attention down that long hall. It was starting to get dark, and I was a pretty small kid, and I looked down that long hallway, and at the other entrance was a large black man. He seemed to fill the whole doorway. He was wearing tattered pants that came down to about his knees, and they were held up by a rope. And I couldn't see his face because he held his head down and his face was in shadow. I wasn't expecting, as a 7-year-old, to see anybody in the house. It scared me, and I went back up to the bar. And I never said anything to anybody. I never talked about it, and it kind of left my mind. I forgot about the incident. Flash forward to about 1961. I was 11 years old, and 4th of July was happening, and the park was jumping with people and food and music, and there was a woman who had newly arrived on the island by the name of Betty Chapman. And Betty had told me beforehand several times that she wanted to introduce me to her son when he arrived from the States. They lived in Florida, and she was preparing the house for them to stay in, and he was going to be finishing up his school year in Florida and then coming down with his dad. And so this 4th of July, there she was, and she was telling me that Jay was there, and I didn't really like to deal with white kids from the States because I was a St. Johnian, and white kids from the States they didn't like this, they were afraid of that, they couldn't walk around barefoot, they were afraid of the ocean, they were afraid of the fish, they didn't like the insects, they didn't like the food, and I just didn't have no truck with them. And I was not wanting to meet this guy named Jay. But she insisted, so I had to be polite. We're walking down the street in Cruz Bay towards the dock. And at that time, the cannon that was at the dock was planted nose first into concrete and had been used in the old days as a hitching post for donkeys and horses. And she points it out to me, and my first thought as an 11-year-old was, oh my God, what a little dwarf, because he was very small for his age, and the ratio in our height remained the same throughout our lives. I was a head taller than him. As I approached and our eyes met, I felt an instant connection. And years later, when Jay and I talked about that and understood what had happened, is that we had always known each other and we recognized each other immediately. And from that moment in our lives, we became best friends and remained best friends until his death. In October of that same year, 1961, Jay decided that he was going to have a Halloween party at the Red House because he and his family were living at another cottage at Gallows Point called the Gatehouse. And so I was there to help him set up and get ready, and we were all done, and we were going to go. It was getting on towards dusk, and guests were going to be arriving soon enough. And we went down to the Red House. As we walked up those front stairs, something drew our energy and our faces towards the far end of that long porch. And there he was, this man that I had seen when I was 6 years old. Well, we were fearless back then, and so we ran directly towards him. And he backed up into that spiny, thorny, large lime tree. We didn't know what to think about that. We ran back towards the front entrance and around the side of the house to go look for him, and he was nowhere to be found. And it was about then that I remembered having seen him when I was 6 years old. Jay later moved into a house called The Rock, and my circumstances changed. My family moved over to St. Thomas, so we weren't hanging out together as much as we had. But I'd come over in the summers and stay at my grandmother's guest house, which had moved from Trunk Bay to Little Maho. It was during his time staying at the Rock that Jay had two dreams that were recurring into adulthood. One was that he would be lying in bed and he would wake up and just know that there was somebody looking down at him very close into his face. And he would be afraid to open his eyes because he thought that he would see a face looking at him when he opened his eyes. Then he would finally open them and there'd be nobody there. The second dream was that he'd see our ghost, and he was chained to a wall in a room, and the room was being bricked in, and Jay would wake up right at the moment when the last brick was put into place. Like I say, these dreams happened off and on into adulthood. Time passed, nothing much happened. There was one moment while he was still living at the Rock when he and another friend were out on the beach at Cruz Bay bailing a boat during a rainstorm, a small dinghy. And his friend looked up and told Stan, "Well, look at that. That's strange. Look at what's out there." And it was our ghost. And he was in this dinghy, and he had was reaching his arms out to them as if in supplication. And as they watched him, he began to fade and slowly shimmered and disappeared. And that was probably one of the last times where Jay talked about seeing him. Time passed. As an older teenager, I would still come over in the summers to stay at Maho Bay, where we had our guest house on the north shore of the island. And one time, Jay and I were out at Annaberg, which are ruins of an old sugar plantation out between Waterlemon Bay and Leinster Bay. And it's a beautiful site, but it holds a lot of energy there, and I'm sure a lot of pain and suffering occurred there. It's the only place that we have on St. John where there are carvings on the little dungeon wall that were etched into the plaster by those who had been imprisoned in that room. And when I was a kid, there were still shackles attached to the wall. Jay and I were out there this one day, and we were by ourselves. It was before there was a lot of tourism on the islands. This was probably about 1966 or 67. And we just had this strong, very strong feeling that we were being followed and watched. And it didn't go away, and it just got stronger, and we got spooked by it. And we decided to leave, and so we're walking back towards Cruz Bay, and that's a good, probably 5 or 6 miles that we were going to be walking back from Annaberg to Cruz Bay. And it was everything we could do to not just run. We felt so followed. We'd keep looking behind us, looking to see if there was somebody following us. And the feeling didn't go away until we got around a turn in the road at the base of a hill called America Hill, which divides Big Maho from Cinnamon Bay. Right around that same time, I had an experience at our guest house at Little Maho, where I was walking on the beach, and I was sure that I heard and felt and saw somebody following me along the beach, but in the bush, and all I could see were a pair of legs. Every time we had these experiences, we had the strong sensation that this energy, this spirit, this ghost was trying to tell us something, that he was trying to get our attention, that he needed our help in some way. We never felt threatened, though as kids it did sometimes scare us. Jay eventually and his family moved from the Rock to a house out on Moorhead Point. And one night when he was home by himself and he was watching television on the porch, and I would say this was probably about 1968, maybe 1969. And he got up to go to bed and turned on the light in his bedroom, and there, standing in his room, not more than 8 feet away, was our ghost. But he was dressed entirely differently. He was dressed in the full, elegant style of the 1760s, 1780s, with the knee breeches and the tights or stockings and the shoes and the waistcoats and cape and tri-corner hat, and very elegantly dressed as someone would be dressed if they had a fair amount of money. And Jay had the opportunity at that point of trying to communicate with him and asked him, "What do you want? What do you need?" And he described it kind of as an information dump into his brain that just overwhelmed him to the point where he couldn't handle it anymore, and he had to tell this apparition to stop. And it was stopped instantly. And at that point, this apparition just began to shimmer and fade away, and he could see the bookcase behind him, and he just slowly disappeared. That is the last that he or I ever saw him. So fast forward, Jay goes into the Navy. I go wandering around the United States, and we're just living our lives. Right around 1975, Jay and I got back together again, and we eventually moved back down to the Virgin Islands. We spent some time living with my sister and her husband on St. Thomas. I got a job with a woman named Terry Craig on St. Thomas, who had a ceramic shop that made ceramic souvenirs for this wholesale for stores in St. Thomas. So I helped her clean greenware and glaze and all kinds of things like that. And Terry was kind of a psychic and sensitive to things of that nature. Her husband was a pilot, and sometimes he would be gone for several days or over long weekends, and she didn't like being by herself during those times. And her house was way out in the middle of nowhere, out towards Bordeaux on the west end of St. Thomas. It was a big double A-frame house. So one time, Jay and I were spending a long weekend with her to keep her and her 2 young boys company. And we were there, and one night I don't know how the conversation got around. She started talking about some of her experiences of going into an alpha state and talking about the guide that she would meet her when she was under and could take her places. She could astral project to different places in different situations and see things. And Jay and I immediately just looked at each other and said, well, here's an opportunity to maybe see or get some information from our ghost about what he wanted. We didn't tell her much. We convinced her to go into an astral state. She was kind of hesitant, but she did it anyway. So she went down and expecting to meet her guide there, but she immediately came back to the surface, as it were, came back to our time, our reality, and was quite startled because he was there. Our ghost was there. And we had not told her anything about him. We had not told her what he looked like. And she described him as being a tall, muscular black man wearing tattered trousers held up by a rope, and that she couldn't see his face, that his face was in shadow. So we knew it was him. And she was very unwilling at first to go back under. But we convinced her to do it, and she did. And I don't remember how long she spent in that alpha state. It could have been a few minutes, it could have been a half an hour. But when she came out of it, she told us that he had taken her to a beach on St. John and to a place near the beach where there were slave huts, and that he had pointed to a spot on the ground, and then she had come back out of it. She was very clear in her description of where she had been on St. John. She was not familiar with the island. She lived on St. Thomas. She didn't really know too much about the beaches. But when she described the beach to us and the trail, we knew that it was at Jumbie Bay, and that the trail she was talking about was one of the old trails between Dennis Bay and Jumbie Bay. And they're on the North Shore, and after Jumbie Bay is Trunk Bay, and before Dennis Bay is Hawk's Nest. And these beaches were you could either get to them over these little trails or easily along the road. Jay and I were very familiar with the trail between Dennis Bay and Jumbie Bay. We had walked it, I don't know, you could say 100 times in our childhood. We had walked over that trail between the two beaches. And neither of us knew anything about a trail off the point between the two or slave huts that were out there. And we weren't quite sure what he was trying to say. But now our friend Terry was intrigued with the story, and she had this very smooth old Formica table, and she made a Ouija board on top of that table, and we put a pointer together. And first thing was we heard footsteps coming up, very solid footsteps coming up the stairs into the back of the house. And the hairs on our arms just rose up. And the first thing that was spelled out was, "Am buried." And so then it was obvious to Jay and me that he was telling us that he was buried on this point of land between Dennis Bay and Jumbie Bay. What we didn't know was why. That all came out in bits and pieces over the next few months. Jay made a Ouija board, and we got his name and learned that his name was Erskine Diat. It was hard getting all of this information through the Ouija board, one little piece at a time, but ultimately his story was that he was an orphan who had been raised by white missionaries in Africa, British missionaries, and they had recognized that he was smarter than most and that he should have an education, so they sent him to England to study medicine. While he was in England, he met a man named Barber Chapman. And Barber Chapman was a sailor and was often first mate on various ships that he would sign up on. At some point, Barber Chapman convinced Erskine to join him, to sign up with him on a merchant ship and be the ship surgeon, and he would be the first mate. My part in that was that I was Barber Chapman's cousin and also a good friend with Erskine Diat. He and Jay get on the ship and they sail off. And when they're well out at sea, the captain, who has hired on free black men, throw all of these free black men into chains with the intent of selling them into slavery in the Caribbean. Barber Chapman to talk with Erskine in the hole, but Erskine will not face him, will not see him, will not look at him, will not talk to him, and keeps his face hidden from him because he believed that Barber was in on this duplicity of throwing him into chains and selling him into slavery. And Barber couldn't convince him that he had not betrayed him. Barber then goes to the captain and confronts him. There's a fight, and Barber is thrown over the side of the ship at night. For his entire life that I knew Jay, he was terrified of being on the water at night on any kind of boat. Eventually, Erskine was sold into slavery and wound up at the estate in Dennis Bay. There was an epidemic of some kind, probably cholera, but it could have been any number of different epidemics. And he was doing what he could for the sick slaves. And the master or owner of Dennis Bay at that point realized that Erskine was a doctor and his wife was ill and he wanted him to save his wife. Well, he couldn't save his wife, and his wife died. And the owner was so enraged and so struck with grief that he had Erskine thrown into a well and buried alive. There are stories about Dennis Bay from other times of slaves being buried up to the neck and decapitated. So Dennis Bay is not a new place where horrors have been committed. So that was Erskine's story that we managed to pull out of him through the Ouija board. It wasn't too much longer after all of this that we also got a passage from the Bible that Erskine wanted read over his grave, because what he wanted from us was that we sanctify his grave, because then it would be a sign to him that he had been forgiven for doubting the friendship of Barbara Chapman. And the verse that he gave us was Hebrew 5:7, which reads, "Who in the days of his flesh, when he offered up prayers and supplication with strong crying and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and was heard because he loved the Lord." So Jay made a cross. We put his name on the cross. We put Hebrews 5:7 on the cross. And we put the date of his death, which was 1766, on the cross. And one beautiful Easter Sunday, my sister and her husband, who was a dowser, and my sister's stepdaughter, and Terry Craig, and Jay and I went out to Jumbi Bay. And we went over the trail to go towards Dennis Bay, which we knew quite well. And none of us knew about this trail going off to the right onto the point of land. But there it was, clear as a bell, as if it had been cleared and had been opened especially for us. There was this trail, and there were these slave huts, just as Terry had described. So the next thing was to find the remnants or some sign of a well. We all took off in different directions, walking up and down, looking around. And at one point, I felt like a pressure and weight on the back of my head to look down at my feet. And there I was, standing in the middle of a circle of stones, which spooked me. I was possibly standing on his grave. And I got off of it, and my sister's husband dowsed for bones. And every time he crossed that area, the rods opened, and we were pretty well convinced that that was where he was. So we planted the cross, we read the Bible verse, we said the Lord's Prayer. And at that moment, there was this incredible sense of joy and release. And we left the area, and none of us spoke. We were just, each of us, experiencing this wondrous, incredible feeling that we had accomplished something that was very important, and that Erskine was finally free. Jay and I went back to where we were living on St. John at the time in Cruz Bay, and we got on our Ouija board, and it was dead. He was gone. And we knew that he had been released. So we chopped up the Ouija board, and we burned it, because we didn't want anybody else coming on that board, and we didn't want to have any other energy on that board. Jay died about 10 years ago, rather suddenly and unexpectedly. And it was really quite hard on me. I was not expecting it, and I really mourned him very, very hard. And then, maybe a week after his death, I had a dream. And I was in this house that was kind of organically grown out of the tropical hillside of an island. It could have been any island, I don't know. It had split levels, and any room you looked out of these prop-up shutter windows, there was a view. There was a view of hills or a view of oceans or a view of a valley, and I was standing in one of the rooms. It was kind of like an open air sort of living room, and I was looking out over this valley that had grass, led down, I think, to the ocean. And I saw Jay, and he was with my donkey that I had when I was a teenager that I dearly loved. And her name was Yeknod, which is donkey backwards. And Jay was with Yeknod, and his back was to me, and I was looking at him, watching him, and he turns around, and he smiled his big, beautiful grin at me and waved. And then he turned, and he and Yeknod walked away. And I knew from that dream that he was okay, and that I didn't need to worry about him, and that I would be okay too. And I've never had any dream of him since, because I know he's wherever he is, that's where he needs to be.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Caribbean Mystics. This is Paulina.
Hey guys, it's Gabby.
And we are diving into this special Halloween episode, which is on a Friday instead of Thursday because, yeah, we like to celebrate. And that story was intense and
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah.
A
It,
lot of twists and
mhm,
turns. I enjoyed it,
mhm.
actually.
Yeah, I felt like Bish was an incredible storyteller. And I also feel like it was really powerful hearing it in person. Like for that particular story, I actually traveled to St. John. And when I was hearing Bish tell the story, she had taken painstakingly a lot of time to write it down. She had several pieces of paper that she had written on back and front. And she used that as a guide because it was really important to her that she did not um, mistell the story. As you can see, there was a lot of like moving parts. And one of the interesting components of this story is that it spans decades.
Yeah, I was
So,
gonna say.
yeah,
I love those stories though. You know what
me
I
too.
mean? Yes, especially from like our elders, and they're so fascinating. And it gave me a little bit of like notebook vibes, even though like I know she didn't say nothing like was romantic between her and Jay. Like I
Yeah.
couldn't help but be like, oh my gosh, like they had
Yearning
this
for a
relationship.
teen romance? You're so
Yeah,
funny.
like a paranormal romance. I don't
Aw, you're so funny. One of the things that like when Bish was actually telling that story in person, toward the end where you started to get more of the story, she had like a actual like visceral in-person reaction, like her hands were shaking, her voice was cracking, and there was like such a clear reverence that she had had for this experience that I thought was actually so moving. And I think it also underscores that when we are collecting these stories become a part of who people are. Like for a lot of people who have these experiences, especially when they're so profound and they're so life changing, these people are sharing a piece of them with us. And I just feel like it really made me truly respect and revitalize within myself why we do this.
Yeah, and something about storytelling too is like when you retell like old memories like that, it's like you're just reliving them again. And I just
Hmm.
love like being enveloped in someone's story like that. And the way she told it, yeah, it was just crazy.
Yeah.
Um, Even, like, from the first time, like, her childhood growing up, like, and this is her childhood friend, like, they used to play and do these trails on the beach, like, it just gives this nostalgia, like, of a Caribbean kid life, like, that's what it was like, barefoot on the beach, discovering these trails, you're always out in nature and
Mhm.
coming across, strange locations, and the house where she saw the man, like, the first time at 6 years old, like, such a creepy scene, and to,
Mhm.
like, reoccur again with her friend Jay, it's just, like, making me think, like, okay, they seem like maybe they're both sensitive, and and then the moment that she meets Jay for the first time, she's like, "No, I don't really, like them white boys, they don't seem to
Mhm.
know nothing about this and that." Which
I
I
can't deal with
get.
them little stateside children. They don't know
No.
how to run barefoot in the mud.
Mosquitoes always attacking them, like but from first sight, when she laid eyes on him, it was like this ding, this like extra this connection. And I
Mhm.
totally relate to that. And I have this deep belief that it is somebody that you knew in a past life. And the only reason I say that is because I totally know how that feels. When I was in 5th grade, I was 10 years old and I had just gone to like a new school. And I remember laying my eyes on this girl. She was a grade below me. And for some reason, I had this extreme, overwhelming sense of like, I know her. That's my sister. Um, I just felt like that was my sister. That's the first thing that came into my head. And we had similar features, like similar skin tone, like brown hair, brown eyes, like shape, like face shape. And it was really eerie. Years go by and we're like friends, really good friends. We end up playing a volleyball game at like Cancrine at another school with another team. And there's a girl that's on that team. And the same thing happened again. As soon as I looked at her and saw her, this overwhelming sense of like, I know her and sister came into my head again. It was like, that's my sister. And there was a weird point where all three of us were standing next to each other and looking at each other with the same vibe. Like, how do I know you? And I remember saying to them, all three of us together, I'm like, why do I feel like I know you? And they're like, I feel the same way too. And all three of us kind of confirmed that like we've never met before, but we feel like we know each other like we're sisters. Um, and then the fourth time it happened, I was in my 20s living in LA and I was going to work and this new girl came into work and same electric feeling. And we had similar features as well. And it was the same thing. Like I felt like I knew her and we were sisters. I've only ever felt it like that. And I felt like all of us as sisters were kind of related in the same lifetime.
Mhm.
And if you look into research on past lives, a funny occurrence is that these past lives tend to kind of return to the place that they lived before. Um, and know the same people that they had in another life. Whether they were their mother or their brother or sister or a friend, they always kind of seem to come around back to each other in the next life. And one of the most famous recorded studies of reincarnation was this young girl in India. And I'm just going to give you like the cliff notes. She had all this factual information, and her mother and father were like, okay, that's sweet. She used to say things like, "Oh, I remember going to that playground," when she'd never been in that playground. She's like, "I used to live in that playground with my husband," like a 4-year-old. And then it got so deep where they started interviewing her, and she got to the point where she knew the address. She's like, "I'll take you to my house that I used to live in." And sure enough, like they go to that house, it's next to that playground. They interview the husband. She gives him the name that she went by in her past life. It's the same name. The husband said that she died. She knew all this information, like friends, family, addresses. It was just like irrefutable evidence. And what's crazy is that when she was reincarnated into her next life, she just lived a few blocks away from her old
Mm.
place.
I find this conversation around like past lifetimes, reincarnation, and then in the context of this story to be like super interesting because if you really lean into it, it really brings forth a lot of existential questions. Like, why was I born on a small island, perhaps one of the
Mhm.
smallest in the Caribbean? You know, why was I born to the family that I was born into?
Mhm.
In relation to like how vast the world is.
Yeah.
There's a book that I really love. It's written by Michael Newton and it's called A Journey of Souls. And if anyone is interested in between worlds, past lifetimes, that book is like incredible. But one of the things that the author asserts is that we are a part of these soul circles and you continue to reincarnate with a lot of the same people. And sometimes when your soul's progression leads you in a different direction, perhaps you're progressing a little bit faster and learning lessons and in just evolution of the soul, you'll move into a new soul circle, but you'll meet people who were in the soul circle with you before and maybe they evolved past. And so it's this constant meeting up of familiar energies alongside new energies. And then just hearing you talk about the case of the little girl in India, there's also a really famous case of a little boy named James Leaninger. And as a 2-year old, he began having nightmares about being a World War II pilot that was shot
Mm.
down by the Japanese. He recalled details about the plane crash, including the names of his carrier ship, the USS Natoma Bay, and the names of a few pilots. His parents were able to corroborate many of the details he had provided. He's 2, so this information is like, there's no way he had access, you know, beforehand. And all of the information he came forward with was super consistent with the life of a pilot named James Huston Jr.
Mm.
And I find these cases to be really fascinating. You know, like I do think that there is a particular susceptibility someone has to have or a particular sensitivity in order for people to really pick up on that feeling of I know you. And I would say that I don't know that I've had that feeling before, but I've definitely had that feeling about an event or a situation. And not deja vu, but like when when it came to my husband, we met in high school. Um, I wouldn't go as far as to say that I felt like I knew him before, but there was something about him that made me feel like I knew that that was who I wanted to pour into in partnership. And I just felt like there was some sort of unexplainable connection where I
Mm.
just felt like I feel like I'm supposed to be with this person. Even before I think we knew that or we were ready to accept that or whatever. Um, and so I find this story to be really interesting in that it is a grand orchestration of the universe that they met at the time that they met and that they started to have these experiences both together and then by themselves and then how they would eventually come about a lot of this information, the Ouija board, you know, their therapist friend living in Bordeaux and St. Thomas, spending the night, you know, when all of this information starts to really like come forward, and then to actually go to the location of this person or this deceased person and to find a lot of what he said was going to be there.
Yeah.
I think it's another just wave of like, this feels deeply destined. And I think that's one of the reasons why when I heard this story, I fell in love with it because I really love the stories, the paranormal stories where you really get the full storyline.
Circle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like you really never get that. And when you do, it's like a
Mm-mm.
stroke of luck, right?
Yeah.
Where you watch people point by point have this experience multiple times over and over again.
Yeah. Well, what's crazy is that apparently she was also someone in a past life
Yeah.
that related to this spirit in
Yeah.
some shape or form. And then she was brought back to the Caribbean again, full circle, through
Yeah.
her family that bought Trunk Bay, which is crazy, by the way.
You know,
And Trunk Bay,
mhm,
if you guys don't know, just go if you have an Apple
it's
computer,
gorgeous.
just look in your wallpapers, your general wallpapers at the stock images that come on your computer. It's in there. What's interesting also about these past lives is sometimes your past life will bleed into your current life. Sometimes you will be born with certain qualities or fears or inhibitions, because it's like some people theorize it's like these unsettled debts that you never got
Mhm.
to finish in your past life.
Yep.
And I often think that about my son, who was born kind of angry.
Cruz, say it ain't
Yes,
so.
yes, 0 to 60, hot fuse, hot temper. He really just has this like innate like fire in him.
Yeah.
And I might have told this story already, but this this psychic doctor, quote unquote, she's like, "Let me tap into him." And she like closes her eyes and I'm like, "Okay." And she's like, I see him. Yeah. I'm just gonna talk to his soul right now and be like, it's okay. It's okay. You don't have to be angry anymore. And she's like, he's better now. And and apparently, like, she's solved so many people's lives doing this. And in my head, I'm like, bitch, he's 3 years old. Like, it's not the end. She's like, in a past life, he was a general in the army, not a current army, an ancient army. He was a warlord. And so coming into this life, he relinquishes his control and he's unable to deal with that in his current life because he's used to being the one taking the lead. And I'm like, Spencer's gonna love this. I was like,
I'm sure.
guess
I'm
what?
sure.
I come home like, guess what? Cruz was a warlord. Like, he's like, fuck yeah.
My thing about the whole past lifetime thing, and I feel like I've said this before, but I feel like when we delve into past lifetimes, I feel like it should never be focused on ego. Like the amount of people that were like, "Oh yeah, I
I
was
was
the witch,"
Cleopatra.
or "I was the witch that they burned at the stake," and like, "Oh yeah, I was
I was
Cleopatra.
Marilyn
I was
Monroe.
a priestess. I was this, I was that." All of that is great, but all of it is completely irrelevant. Completely. If you're not going into your past lifetimes to understand why you have certain phobias so you can work past it, to validate feelings that you've always felt so you could move past it, to understand karmic connections so you could move past it. I feel like there's a way where we perverse the information to suit our human ego.
Hmm.
And I think that the past lifetime work is work that is like, it's soul work, it's therapy. And I just feel like modern spirituality, that new age business has really
Yeah.
industrialized, made it into a commercialized, has
Yes.
really commercialized like the work of the past lifetimes. And I say that because even when you look at
It's
shop,
also easy to fucking fake. There's
yeah,
no validations, rarely any validations to back up any claims. They could
yeah.
tell you whatever you want.
But when you look at shamans, like, and this is why I don't want to completely like erode the work of the past lifetime stuff, because I do believe that there is truth there. And I do believe that there are people who can tap in. I just think that a lot of people just can't, or a lot of people are tapping in, but they're tapping into a very superficial egoic side.
Hmm.
In South America and Central America, where shamans are like super prevalent, they literally, one of their responsibilities, and being a shaman is incredibly hard work because you literally have to get to a state where your soul leaves your body and then you go into the spirit world, in between realms, in between dimensions, and you're literally finding the lost souls or the fragmented parts of souls for people and bringing them back. Maybe that person has some sort of illness that they aren't able to get rid of. Maybe that person is dying and cannot come to terms with death until they retrieve this fractal of their soul that's missing. Or maybe a woman loses a fractal of her soul through a childbirth experience that's incredibly like, you know, devastating, right? And it's just, I find that work to be so powerful and so important. And it's almost in that same vein of past lifetimes or that work of going in and retrieving that information. But it is so sacred and so sanctified. And the way that we now almost create these readings and this information as an assembly line. Like, yeah, come on over. I'll tell you why you've been having that dream that you've been in a cave for the last 4 years, like, and then it's just this very construed story. And something that I also find that makes this situation that much more terrible is you will get real feedback, right? Where it'll be like, hey, P, pretend I read in you. Hey, Paulina, one of the things that continues to come up in your past lifetimes is that you get lost in motherhood, right? Because this is something that you are very fearful of is I'm Paulina and I want to be my own person, right? While also being a mother who loves her children and honors her children. So I tell you, hey, this is something that comes up in every single lifetime. And the reason why it's so pervasive for you now is because you are doubling down on the fact that I will not repeat this in this lifetime. And this is why you are currently going through this oscillation around, I want to be my own person and be a mom in a society that tells you can only choose one, right? And
Mm-hmm.
then the reader goes on and is just like, oh yeah, and your man is your soulmate, right? A lot of people will leave that reading and will be like, oh my God, my man is my soulmate. And all of the information that is actually so important, that is the real healing and is the real bulk of the work, we discard and we go for the low hanging fruit of
Mm.
my man is my soulmate. And it's
Yeah.
just like, guys,
So
we are
nice to hear.
desecrating the work.
Yeah,
Correct. We get so in line with what we want to hear and not what the real work is?
absolutely. Moving an ego. Or when
Yeah.
people, what really irritates me is when people justify actions because they were so and so in a past life. And it's like,
Paulina, don't get me
so you
started
could.
today. Don't get me started. You know how
You're
much people
like,
have moved to the
I
VI and
was
it's
a
just like, I had a
chief.
past lifetime in the VI.
Yes.
Like,
I was a chief warrior princess. So
yeah.
I can walk on these lands and do what I please because
Yeah.
I was an indigenous princess here. And I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, but now you're a white girl. So, like,
Yeah. And that's not to say that like that's not to say that that may not be a real experience for some people,
yeah.
but it is to say that that can be your identity in this lifetime.
Yeah, you're in a
Like,
new life now.
yeah, like you don't get to give up your responsibility in this lifetime of how you came into the world and your privilege in this, socioeconomic construct and this and other, because in a past lifetime you happen to be in an oppressed situation. Don't, girl, I could talk about that for hours. But anyway, moving on.
Yeah.
Moving on, the Ouija board comes up in this.
Hmm.
And I'm really excited about that because I actually don't think we've had a story up until this point that leveraged the Ouija board or the spirit
Yeah.
board. And
Because, yeah,
mhm,
you're right. And
like
it's
we've talked about
such a common
tarot.
trope. It's such a
Yeah.
common trope in like haunted stories. Oh, we are playing with the Ouija board. But I think because like Caribbean people don't fuck with that. Like,
Yeah.
they're like, nah, I'm good.
I very rarely. I had a lady who actually had reached out to me and she had an Ouija board story, but she hasn't come forward to do it. And I don't want to keep harassing her. But I like that this story includes the Ouija board, because it's such a old
Hmm.
type of like form of divination.
Divination. But they
Um,
made it, which is even
yeah,
cooler.
yeah, because they've literally infused their energy into the board.
Hmm.
And also the
They didn't go
Ouija
to a
board.
Target.
Yeah, correct. The Ouija board has so much potential to go so wrong so quickly.
Mm,
And it is almost like opening a door and allowing anything to come forward, especially
mm.
if you are someone that is not skilled in using it. Now,
That's what you hear. Yeah.
they were with a psychic, but then they went on to their own selves to continue using the Ouija board, which I would assume at that point in time that the psychic gave them like the do's and don'ts of the Ouija.
But
Um,
wait, she didn't seem like she was I'm officially a psychic. Like it sounded like she just kind of happened to be able to do this thing and she was going to try it on them. She's like, "Hey, sometimes I can go into this weird state and meet like
Retrieve
a
this information.
spirit guide." Yeah, like she didn't seem like I am a psychic. These are the rules. This is what you do. Like it just seems like, "Hey, I can kind of do this thing and it's weird, but like let's
It
try
was, like,
it."
recreational.
Yeah, like
I
she
got that
just
im
dabbled on the side.
I got that impression too, but she also seemed to, like, have a bit more knowledge, like, she was talking about spirit
Mm,
guides and, meeting the spirit guides in a particular location, and it seemed like it was something that she, was
experience.
relatively, yeah, experienced with. I wouldn't say she was a professional, that wasn't alleged in the story, but it seemed like she had enough information, and then she had this Ouija board just sitting on the side as well, so there's also that. Um but I like the use of the Ouija board in the story. And I just find the Ouija history to be so interesting. Like, why are they selling that in the kids section of stores?
Yeah, still.
Um, yeah. And it was so big back in the 1900s, like early 1900s, mid 1900s, late 1900s, like the entire 20th century. People were
Mhm.
just out here raging over the Ouija board.
Spiritualism, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's actually so fascinating.
I loved that period of time. Because it's so macabre. Like, not only
Mhm.
were they trying to talk to the dead, like, that was the right? We talked
Yeah,
about in the last episode, the seances in these Victorian houses with the upper crust of, the
society.
society.
Ah.
Not only did they try to talk to the dead, they also would purchase mummies. In this Victorian era where spiritualism was high, but there was also a phase called Egyptomania, where these wealthy people, especially in France and England, were fascinated by ancient Egypt. And they would buy real Egyptian mummies, sometimes through black market trade, and host, quote, unwrapping parties, end quote. And so guests would gather, and someone, often a scientist or an antiquarian or a showman, they would unwrap the linen wrappings of the mummy in front of the crowd. And it was treated as both like entertainment and science, though today it's obviously considered deeply unethical and disrespectful. Um, and most of these events, a lot of these events were held in private homes and sometimes as public spectacles in lecture halls. People were obsessed with this morbid culture back then.
This is why people don't care that they just stole all of those diamonds from the Louvre. And this is why.
Yeah, you go to the Louvre. I've been there once many,
Uh,
many years ago. And I remember like, wow, there's so much Egyptian artifacts.
mhm,
And in my head, I was like, shouldn't these be in Egypt? Like,
mhm.
give them
For so
back.
long, the countries, like, it's not just Egypt, like, there's quite a bit of, African countries that are just like, "Hey," to the British Museum, to the Louvre, they're just like, "Hey, why not? You can give us back our people, stuff that you stole."
Yeah.
And they still haven't been able
And you're
to.
still displaying and profiting off of it,
Exactly,
which is
exactly,
weird. It's weird.
exactly. And it's demoralizing because what's the underlying tone is that so you have the wherewithal to display our history and we don't. Because I think that's one of the arguments, right?
They're like, sorry, not sorry.
Yeah, they're just like, "Oh, well, we have the facilities and the expertise to be able to preserve this, like, Victorian, ball
Yeah.
gown worn by, Queen Elizabeth the First, right?" And it's just like, so what you're saying is that the people of the culture, or I should say Cleopatra, right? The people of the culture don't have that expertise. They don't have that
Mhm.
wherewithal. So it should stay with you, like just this really colonial mindset with
Yeah.
art and with these treasures that are like
Mhm.
valueless.
Yeah. Agreed.
So back to the story, one of the my favorite parts of the story is the end, right? Where we start to tie up all of these loose connections and they finally go to this site that they had heard about, right? They had all of these details there. There was this well and there were these slave huts and that no one
Mhm.
knew kind of like existed. And they go to this area and they find remnants of what Erska Bay had told them was there through the Ouija board. And then the ending of the story is really interesting to me, where they almost say a prayer and put a Bible scripture.
Uh,
One of the reasons why I think that that in and of itself is deeply fascinating is I know I don't rah-rah a lot about religion, but I do think that when your soul feels particularly aligned with a belief system, um, that sometimes can transcend, like
uh,
lifetimes. And I didn't get the impression that Bish and her friend Jay were like super religious or
yeah,
whatever, but I thought it was really special that they listened to Erskabe's message and they decided to honor him in the way that he created a relationship with God. And I think that there's a lot of beautiful lessons here, right? About, one, how we relate to the dead, about compassion. There's so much compassion in this story, right?
yeah,
There's so much elements of like friendship and friendship that transcends beyond timelines. So much inquiries here around destiny and reincarnation and, how many of our decisions are ours and how many of our decisions are these gentle nudges along the stream of life, right? And this particular stream is a stream that you selected in the beginning, or it's the stream that leads you to the destiny that you're intended to like fulfill.
yeah. One thing that I feel so unsettled with is that, like, they had all this information. Was there any way they could have, like, checked up on it, like, followed up with it
Mhm.
with, like, historical records or archives? I mean, they would have to look back in England, right? Is that where she said that
Mhm.
he was raised by a missionary?
Yeah.
And then maybe on these ships, I know, like, the ships often keep records of those that are on board.
Mhm.
Um, because I'm like, there's so much information here. If
That
I
you
was
could look
like,
it up. Yeah.
yeah, so I'm so curious to that because you know me, I want that validation. I want to see like the name on paper, the this and that. There's a few names. There's
Yeah.
Barbara
Chapman.
Chapman.
Mhm.
Yeah. So
Mhm.
I don't know. I'm gonna try to dig a bit, but that kind of
Yeah.
digging is extensive, and I know you gotta be physically there sometime in these like genealogy libraries,
Yeah.
sifting through paperwork.
So much of the stuff isn't digitized either. So you kind of have
Yes.
to travel. Yeah. Yeah. It's one of the hard parts about really understanding VI history is so much of our archives actually exist in Europe, in Denmark,
Mm,
Um, and so it's one of the challenges of having had that colonial background, is you don't always have access to your records. And then when you get your records, they're through the lens of the colonizer and not the colonists.
mhm.
So you have to do a level of decolonization with those records as well, because they're told through a one dimensional perspective. But I feel like this was a really nice episode. It's one of my favorite stories that we've gotten so far. And yeah, Bish, thank you so much for sharing this story
Yeah,
and for sharing your time with me that one morning because I literally could feel her emotion in this. I could feel her
yeah.
heart, and it was a truly incredible, special experience. And so I'm really grateful that she shared that with us.
Same. Thank you so much. And happy Halloween, happy Samhain, All Hallows Eve. Enjoy your weekend. Be
Day
safe
of the
out
Dead.
there. Dia de
Mhm.
Dead, Dia de los Muertos. All of it.
Yeah. Before we go, I just want to shout out we have a person that listens to our podcast. They are on our Patreon and they have been such a loyal listener. They have shared their story for Patreon. That was pretty creepy. It was about a doppelganger. And they're always just so connected to what we have going on. And so recently they sent us fan art, which I think might be one of our first fan arts that we've gotten.
Oh, it's so good.
Yeah. And it's connected to last season. So season 3, episode 3, Go to Nature. And if you haven't listened to that episode, it's pretty special. It also takes place on St. John, as fate would have it. But she, in the story, the storyteller recounts a encounter with this otherworldly being, and she describes it in the story to great detail. And so our follower, Conch Digital, or her name is Maylene, but Conch Digital on her socials, I'll include it in the show notes. She put together this incredible piece of art that's actually so beautiful and cute. It is
It's really
not,
cute.
yeah, it is not an AI generated image. She was actually like really like, hey, don't put us in AI. Like, this is my hard work. And so I just wanted to shout her out because I think she's such an incredible,
Yes.
like Misty, and it makes us feel really good about the work that we're doing when we are able to build community doing the work.
I love it. I love the image. It is so cute. It almost looks like a little Pokemon. Like,
Yeah, it's so like a
it's like,
Jigglypuff. It's so cute.
hey.
Uh,
Thank you for listening to Caribbean Mystics Podcast.
If you enjoyed the show, don't forget to share with your family and friends. Like, follow, and subscribe to keep up with all of our spooky Caribbean content.
Do you have a story you'd like to share that took place in the Caribbean? Email us at caribbeanmysticspodcast@gmail.com. That's caribbeanmysticspodcast@gmail.com. Or check the show notes for more info.
Caribbean Mystics is created and hosted by Paulina Creaky and Gabrielle Carrard. Theme song is Folktale Juve Rhythm by Umi Marcano.